How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by the founder of Barbell Medicine and an elite level powerlifter. Today, I am joined by the one and only Dr. Jordan. Oh, I messed up the first name, not even the second name. We just spoke about this.
So much pressure.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. I've got that right.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
No worries at all. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. Hopefully the rest of the podcast goes as swimmingly as the introduction.
That's right.
How are you? What's been happening in your world? What have you been up to?
Sure. Yeah. If you guys are following me on social media, and I don't know when this thing is going to go up, but I recently had a powerlifting meet that did not go so well. I ended up tearing my adductor on my third squat attempt at 290 kilos. And so that was not pleasant, but I'm trying to be positive and silver lining. So a lot of rehab content now. I just feel like is a unique space for us, or a place for us in the strength and conditioning world. So we'll do that. I would have liked to be able to tell you, I had all-time PR total. I, finally broke 817 and a half kilos for my total, but it was not to be. And, I'll just kind of take the hand I'm dealt and move forward. But that's what's been going on. Between that, we have an app that's about to drop. And I won't try to do any more self-promotion here unless there's some room for that. But so otherwise that's just been what's been going on.
Yeah. And how's your recovery going, from that as well? How is you because you've been putting up the rehab stuff from there. How are you feeling, and how are you progressing with it?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, between you, me, and your listenership, the biggest issue for me had been like mentally, because it had been a pretty long prep. This is unique for me, particularly in the last like 4 or 5 years. Normally what I would do is I would be feeling good in training and then pick a meet like a month away, just so I could just do it. It wouldn't be too much, not necessarily pressure, but like just right now in my life, I don't have like, I got 3 months or 4 months where I can dedicate for meet prep. And I know if you're not a powerlifter, particularly with like a long competitive history, that sounds like crazy. Like, why does it take 4 months to prep? You just are training and then you go compete. Well, for me to like get to a level where I'm going to potentially PR all my lifts, PR my total, I mean, that's kind of what it takes to do, in addition to like being like healthy and strong going into the meet prep. Previously, like these last 2 meets I've competed in, I had just been doing well in training and found a meet a month away and just kind of did it. This one, I kind of wanted to dedicate some more time to and think, all right, if I pull out all the stops, can I PR my total? Like that's what I wanted. And so mentally going into a meet and then not really being able to demonstrate what my training had been, because this training what had been excellent. I had PR'd my squat, I PR'd my deadlift, my bench was close enough to PR levels that I could have done PR'd my total. And so that was pretty disappointing. The pain from the injury, I mean, I used to race dirt bikes. So like, I've had compound fractures and stuff, and I'm not, just not like a flex. It's just like, by comparison, the pain wasn't that bad. Yeah. And it hurts in weird things. Like if I'm sitting for a while, like I just binged on the Squid Game thing on Netflix. If I get to like stand up quickly after that, it's like, oh wow, that's interesting. Standing is tough. But training, I've been able, I can squat to parallel and I can deadlift, not anything where I'm normally lifting, but I think and the bruising was pretty significant too. So anyway, the whole thing on this is if it's really, really torn, sometimes there's an indication for surgery, like torn, like more than, I forget if it's 80% or whatever, if you rupture the tendon. None of that happened. And my function is, it's good enough where I think it's going to be like a 2-month thing, but I've been wrong before. So we'll see.
Yeah, I can completely understand with the mental side of things, because from myself having injuries and clients that I've worked with, it is that thing of when you're dedicated time to something and then you do get injured, you know that you're not going to be injured forever. But it's just is that mental side of things. In terms of, with barbell medicine, how are things opening up and the world getting slightly back to normal? How is that looking with barbell medicine in terms of, seminars and traveling, or is that restricted in terms of what you're doing?
So domestically in the United States, especially in, certain states, Texas, Florida, even California, the states are mostly open. So we've been able to get back to doing seminars. Internationally is tough, mainly because we don't know how it's going to go. I would love to go back. London is my favorite place on the planet. I love it. And I would love to come back London and maybe do some other spots in Europe. Last time we were there, we were in Berlin. And so I'd love to do one in London. It's just hard to schedule and then be like, okay, yeah, for sure. We can go to Europe. We can go, or in this case, we can go to the UK and put on a seminar. It's just hard to know. So looking like maybe middle or end of 2022, if we feel more secure about international travel. Also, what's been interesting is that because of the pandemic, we've been almost forced to do some more online learning stuff. So we've been doing a lot of recording of online ed stuff from our seminar and like expanded topics. So Austin and I have been doing that, and we're trying to make that available even for people who would never be able to make it to a seminar. Like if you live somewhere that we're not going to go, just based on either market demographics or like, I don't know that I want to go to, certain parts of the world right now. I'm not going to name them because we're going to get hate mail, but, at least you'll have access, right? Because, if you have an internet connection. So it's been an interesting pivot. But yeah, United States, particularly where I live, is things are trending well. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that in a year's time, things will look different from a international travel landscape. So,
cool. I like to touch on that because I know from purely on a selfish point of view, and I can imagine some of the listeners have done the courses online as well. From not being able to get to a lot of the seminars with a lot of things online now, it's a little bit more accessible to look at courses, which is good. For everyone, I know I did a little bit of an introduction, but for everyone listening who might not know your background, the work with barbell medicine, competing in powerlifting, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Sure, yeah. So my name is Jordan Feigenbaum. I've been a competitive powerlifter since 2000, I believe 10 was my first meet. I am a trained physician. I've been a strength coach since, over 10 years now. And so what happened was in medical school, I basically had just sold the gym, got into medical school, and then I was kind of going through the preclinical education, which is all in the classroom. And invariably at every step of the way, the professors were paying lip service to lifestyle med, which is effectively exercise, dietary interventions, sleeping better, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, well, this is great. They're recommending this or whatever. When I got into some of the patient care stuff during the second 2 years, and even the standardized patient stuff that we got exposed to early on, I realized there was a lack of two fundamental sort of things. One was a fund of knowledge with respect to, okay, well, what exercise should we recommend? What dietary interventions should we recommend? You're like, yeah, no, improve your diet and improve your physical activity. It's like, okay, but like what specifically? And there are guidelines for this. So it's kind of like, okay, that's one like shortage. And then the other shortage was actually like how to engage in this behavioral change counseling at a level that gets people to remove whatever barriers or obstacles or work around those obstacles to get them to participate. And so when you are looking at that problem, you're like, okay, well, what solution do we need? Yes, we need education stuff out there. And there wasn't any. So I was like, all right, I'm happy to do this. And I'm super interested in had been a coach for a long time. So that seemed very, very like an easy transition. The behavioral change stuff has been more of a recent evolution because, so you're, for example, you've coached people, you work at a gym, every personal training cert, coaching cert or whatever, there's a lot of focus on the fund of knowledge. There's a Krebs cycle, for example, and like all of these certifications. And you learn a lot about, energy systems and muscles and this, that, and the other. That's all great. But the behavioral change aspect of this is sorely lacking. And a lot of that has to do with self-selection. People come into the gym looking for a personal trainer or coach, or people contact online coaches or whatever. They're ready to go. They're like, I'm ready to change, or I'm ready to engage in this behavior. But in the real world, particularly in public health, there's a lot of folks who may not be ready to do that. And I think that being able to serve both the like very motivated folks and then also the folks who may be on the fence That's what's going to improve the health of the community. So I felt like we needed to shore that up or bring some resources into that. So yeah, that's kind of what barbell medicine is. It's this integration of strength conditioning and modern medicine, really looking at it from both the educational perspective, but then also like motivational interviewing, behavioral change counseling. Like we need all of that. So you need all of those skills, and we're trying to provide resources for that for both medical and fitness professionals.
Yeah. Oh, cool. It kind of goes nicely into the topics that we had or I had in mind for today, because sure. I think it is a case of blending it together. I know with all the powerlifters that I coach in the gym is somebody who has come into the gym who has never had. I've got one woman who has never had a gym membership before. Never been into a gym, and after having a couple of sessions with her and chats with her conceptions or thoughts around what a gym should be is completely different. But she is doing strength training. She is, changing her nutrition and getting involved in the strength training side of things. And the first question that I kind of wanted to touch on there is, one of the things that you mentioned is obviously health, and there's lots of things that encompass, what is health, and what do you think is there where sometimes people have misunderstandings around what health is, and that powerlifting or strength training doesn't necessarily fall into that, because people think we're going to get injured, we're going to get too bulky. People think that health is you need to be running all the time, you need to be doing X, Y, and Z. Where do you think this misconception comes from?
Oh, man. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, we start our seminars out with us like, what is health? Where does this definition come from? And how can it, potentially inaccurate definitions lead us and the public astray? And so if you go back and you look at the World Health Organization, WHO's definition from 1948, they define health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And so if you think about that, you're like, when have I ever felt the complete absence of like well-being in all physical, mental, and social, well-being? When have I felt that? I don't know that anybody's ever attained that, and so you're kind of like, wait, is everybody unhealthy? And it's also like vague in such a way that you're like, okay, well, what is physical health? What is mental health? What is social health? And so then you kind of have to go down that rabbit hole. A definition that we like is actually from the British Medical Journal in 2011, and it's more based on self-efficacy. So the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical, and emotional challenges. So effectively, it's a person who's able to function independently and adapt to the various challenges and rigors that are presented to them in life. And from a physical standpoint, physical development standpoint, there are certain strength metrics that you need to be able to possess to interact with your environment, not only from like an activities of daily life standpoint, but like recreational pursuits. And then you can go a little further down that line and say, well, if you attain enough strength, you're reducing your risk of developing chronic disease. As a powerlifter, I want everybody to be, real strong, just because that's my bias, right? But if you put a gun to my head and you say, well, how strong do you need to be healthy? It's probably not as strong as, most people would think. Do you need to be able to squat body weight, for example? I don't know. I think when you look at the data on this, a lot of it is observational, huge, sample sizes like in the millions of subjects. The highest quartile of strength, yes, has a significant reduction in premature mortality, so death prematurely, disease development, and then death from these diseases, so like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, etc. So how strong do you need to be to get in that upper quartile? I feel like the act of resistance training and meeting the current physical activity guidelines with respect to resistance training, which is 2 to 3 times per week at a minimum. I think if you're doing that, particularly in a way that meets the guidelines, so you'd be exercising all the major muscle groups at an intensity that feels kind of uncomfortable multiple times per week, you're probably in that upper quartile. If you squat 3 times body weight, that's great. You're like, near elite level powerlifter, but you're already so far past that sort of minimum strength that we need to like reduce disease risk. At that point, we're looking at performance. So that's from a strength standpoint. There are correlates to that, like power Many of these big studies talk about power being having a strong relationship with reduced or improved health trajectory. And so that's just like, yeah, you're strong enough that you can apply force rapidly. So your power production's up. And even further down the line is muscle mass. So lean body mass. There are correlates between lean body mass and health trajectory. And so the idea is, yeah, if you're carrying around a significant amount of lean body mass, you're probably stronger than the average bear and more powerful than the average bear. And so that puts you in this upper quartile. So again, I think a good recommendation would be to, at least at a minimum, all people need to meet these physical activity guidelines for resistance training. Again, you're training all of the major muscle groups multiple times per week through a relatively large range of motion at an intensity that feels kind of uncomfortable. That's like the minimum. And then you kind of move down the line. All right, cool. So that's resistance training. What about aerobic training, cardiorespiratory fitness training? And again, there's this dose-dependent relationship between cardiorespiratory fitness development and health trajectory. So the higher your cardiorespiratory fitness level, the better your health trajectory is. It seems to be like just, again, dose-dependent with no upper bound. Well, what's the minimum level to get to that, highest quartile? Well, again, meeting the physical activity guideline minimums is a great place to start. And there are, I guess, weekly sort of minimum duration targets. So it's 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity. That's they rate that on metabolic equivalence. So 4 to 6 METs. That's pretty much a brisk walk for most folks, unless they have existing disease, in which case it's probably going to be lower. Or 75 to 150 minutes of vigorous intensity activity, which is above 6 METs. And so that's just higher intensity stuff. And I think meeting that on a weekly basis is the minimum that we should be shooting for. Most powerlifters probably are not meeting that minimum activity recommendation from a cardiorespiratory fitness standpoint, unless they have interests outside the gym that make them, they go cycling, they go hiking, stuff like that. And so I think that would be a target for competitive athletes, that, hey, during your off season and like most of your training until you get right up to the meet, like you need to be doing that just from a health standpoint. For the Gen Pop, that should be the minimum that they're trying to attain anyway, and ideally exceed. So I think from a health perspective, meeting those guidelines is like, that's the benchmark we're trying to get to. And above that is more of either you're seeking performance improvements, or as an individual, you need more to get to that level. So there may be people that meet those minimums and aren't getting the cardiorespiratory fitness improvements that we need to see, or the strength improvements that we need to see. I mean, there are studies showing people that were bench pressing, these elderly women bench pressing twice per week for a whole year, and their bench press did not improve. And so I would be looking at the programming, but then also like, all right, well, they were participating, but they didn't actually get stronger. On the one hand, there's data showing that just because you didn't get stronger doesn't mean you're not deriving the health benefits from it, but I'd still like to see that trajectory of improved strength to hedge my bets against, you need to attain this certain level of strength in order to improve your health. So for your audience, the take home from that is meet the guidelines at a minimum. Anything above and beyond that is for performance or individual needs. And I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, it was quite good that you rounded up speaking about the general population and the powerlifting side of things. I kind of wanted to touch on, well, two things from there. Sure. From the general population, looking at, because I know you mentioned there resistance training, you didn't say powerlifting training. And do you think people think that when it comes to resistance training, strength training, whoa, does that mean that I need to have to do a 3 times bodyweight squat? I need to work towards that. Whereas actually, what's the minimum level of strength that we need? Because strength is relative towards the person. Sure. And then on the flip side of that, when we're looking at the powerlifters, do you think that, you've said there that they neglected the sides of the health side of things, that they think, oh, well, I'm a powerlifter, so I don't need to do any of these things. Whereas actually, to become a better powerlifter, they do need to focus on the health side of things. Does that kind of make sense? Them 2 points?
Yeah. So for the Gen Pop perspective, I think the main, I guess, myth that is perpetuated is that resistance training is dangerous. And I think that stems from this idea that you have to lift super, super heavy in in ways that are inherently risky. And I think there are multiple problems with that assumption. So one, lifting heavy does not necessarily incur a greater risk than lifting lighter. The real sort of predictor here is how well prepared are you for the task at hand. If you the riskiest like time going to the gym is the first time you stepped foot in the gym, and at that point the load, not just the weight, but like the reps, sets, so volume, the weight on the bar, the total training load, how many exercises are you doing? That's what you really need to control. As you get more and more trained, your work capacity, your training tolerance all goes up. You become effectively more resilient, more resistant, more robust to any sort of perturbation that like, whoa, well, I was a little stressed today, or my, from home life, or the environmental stress was higher or whatever. And it just, kind of outstripped my ability to tolerate the training. Well, that kind of ceiling goes up and up and up the more and more trained you become. If you're untrained completely, then that, those first few sessions are kind of like, that's the time where you'd want to like apply the most amount of care, I guess. But even that, so if you look at the data on attitudes towards resistance training, and you survey people and ask them why aren't they participating, about 50% will say, I'm afraid of getting injured. Yeah. And so how do you combat that? Well, the data suggests that resistance training is very, very safe, even like relatively heavy, even competitive, like powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, CrossFit, bodybuilding, et cetera. The injury rates are on average 2 to 4 injuries per 1,000 participation hours, which is about the same or lower in many cases of other non-contact activities. Yeah. So, and then in that, these injuries are relatively short lasting. They resolve before 2 weeks. So they're not catastrophic. People aren't like, I ruptured a pec tendon, or, I severed a limb or something like that. The worst thing that can happen, the thing that persists the longest, is when people have accidents in the gym. Like they drop weights on themselves, for example. But the actual like rate of catastrophic injuries, or injuries that require more than 2 weeks to sort of resolve, are very, very low. So how do you combat that? I think you're, from a population standpoint, you're going to need a big public service sort of media campaign. But then at a more grassroots level, organic level, when you ask people, well, where did you sort of learn that resistance training was going to be dangerous? And they either they point to their doctor, or they point to other healthcare professionals, or other people who have large spheres of influence, particularly on social media. Probably has a huge social learning effect. And so what you would want then are people with these big spheres of influence, physicians, other healthcare professionals, social media sort of stars, if you will, to be putting forth this narrative that, hey, resistance training is relatively safe. You should definitely participate. The risks of not participating are very, very high. And so is there a risk with participating? Sure, but those are vastly outweighed by the benefits of participating in resistance training. And so if further, to hedge your bets against getting injured, it's not that your technique has to be perfect. There's no way it's going to be perfect when you start out. You're going to do stuff wrong. The main thing is it's going to self-organize over time into an efficient, repeatable sort of way for you to perform that task. The main thing to reduce risk of injury is going to be controlling that load, the training load, based on what you've been exposed to, your current level of fitness, et cetera. So having a way to kind of auto-regulate that would be super useful. So that's from a public like Gen Pop perspective. From a powerlifting perspective, the question, oh man, it just left your what was your
about health for the powerlifter. So they've gone too far one way of well, I just need to lift really heavy.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing is, powerlifting training by definition is compromised training. And I don't mean that in a terribly negative way, but if you think about it, you're really training for the squat, bench, deadlift, to the exclusion of maybe other physical characteristics that could be developed. So you really care about your vertical pressing strength. Do you care about rapid force production? I mean, not that much. Do you care about developing a lot of strength stamina, where you improve strength in the 10 to 15 rep range? Do you care about developing unique mobility in movement, in ranges of motion that you're never going to see on the platform? And it's not that developing those things improve your health, really, but they are since you're not doing that, you've compromised your training to focus by definition on the squat, bench, deadlift to powerlifting standards. So powerlifting, again, as you start, is compromised. I do not think that you should compromise cardiorespiratory fitness development. I don't think that you need to have the same cardiorespiratory fitness development as an endurance athlete. That's not what I'm saying. And so there's this kind of inflection point where by doing more cardiorespiratory fitness training, you're probably compromising your ability to train at a high enough volume and frequency, et cetera, to get better at powerlifting, just so you can get better with this endurance, this cardiorespiratory fitness. But below that, it probably actually has a beneficial effect on your powerlifting training, because as you improve this big base of physical development, particularly from a cardiorespiratory fitness standpoint, you're able to tolerate more training, you're able to recover faster, both in between sets, in between sessions, just because your work capacity has increased. So how much cardio do I want you to develop? Well, that inflection point is going to be different for everybody. It's just individualized to the person, their genetics, their previous training, their response to training, et cetera. And so at a minimum, I want you to hit the minimum guidelines at a minimum. And then above that, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure thing. I don't have a super specific test that you can participate in and say, ooh, I've got enough. But the general rule of thumb is I want you to do as much conditioning as you can without it compromising your ability to train for powerlifting in the long term. It may do that in the short term if you have not developed that, you have no history of, cardiorespiratory fitness development or minimal history, but I don't care what happens in 4 weeks unless you have a meet in 4 weeks.
Yeah.
If the meet is in 4 months, well, let's take a little bit of time. We're going to, sure, the numbers on the bar may not go up as much, or they may go down transiently, but you'll be in a better place 4 months from now than you were, by doing this. And so people were going to throw around, well, what about the interference effect? And the interference effect is this idea that if you do a significant amount of conditioning work and anaerobic work, particularly resistance training, that you're going to get compromised results on both. There's been a lot of molecular studies that have come out to show a potential mechanism. But what we think it is now is just that it's so much training volume that people have a difficult time showcasing the fitness adaptations from the training. So effectively what you're doing is concomitantly developing a lot of fitness adaptations and training fatigue. And so when you combine a lot of fitness adaptations and a lot of fatigue, the resultant performance potential is kind of neutral, maybe even depressed if the fatigue is high. But as you get used to the training, as you get more tolerant of the training, as your work capacity increases, that balance shifts. The fitness adaptations continue to increase, and the fatigue that you're generating from each training session, each series of training sessions goes down. You've accommodated. And so the performance potential should increase. That's the idea. And so I view the interference effect as this sort of transient depression in performance potential secondary to too much fatigue. It's almost like, yes, you've done too much training. You didn't get injured, but you're not improving as much as you otherwise would expect. And again, I think it's short term. Ideally, most people would gradually increase their cardiorespiratory fitness training. So where do you start? You start at, by the end of 1 week or 2 weeks, I'd like you to be hitting the physical activity guideline minimums if you're otherwise healthy individual who's actively participating in powerlifting training, and keep it there for a month, 6 weeks. Add a little bit to taste, right? To as for your preferences, for what you feel like your cardiorespiratory fitness development is. And then, you don't need to challenge the upper limits of human performance from an endurance standpoint. Because again, at that point, your training volume is so high for endurance that I don't think you could do enough training to get better at powerlifting. But you should be trying to kind of push both things, I think, particularly when you're further away from a meet. So that's kind of how I view that.
Yeah, definitely. Especially on the powerlifting side of things. Obviously, you've mentioned there, it's relative to the person. I think a lot of people can focus on the negative sides of, oh, well, if I do cardio, if I do conditioning, that's going to ruin the amount of weight that I can squat or deadlift or bench or anything. Whereas actually, there's a lot more. There's two sides to everything, isn't there? And there's going to be a lot more benefits to that. Whereas that whole thing of cardio is going to ruin my gains. I'm not going to be able to squat again. Whereas, yeah, if you're going to run a marathon, maybe that is, maybe a little bit too much, but something as low level as just hitting a step count, walking, you've got to meet the demands of where you're at. And then flipping that over to the Gen Pop side of things, when you mentioned about, because there's the research there in terms of, the risk of injury, those 1,000 hours, the fact that actually strength training is recommended in terms of guidelines. But then, when people are thinking of or being told that it's going to be an injury risk, is that one of those things where, the education needs to change in terms of, as an entry point of just increasing people's general activity levels, that strength training is actually, a good starting place to then add the extra layer on in terms of conditioning? Because I know I've had, Gen Pop clients thinking, I'm not fit enough to do this, I'm not going to be able to do this. Whereas for powerlifting or strength training, okay, you can use barbells, but even something as basic as a goblet squat, that's still resistance training, depending on the person who's coming in.
Yeah, I mean, there are almost infinite ways to meet the resistance training sort of guidelines. And so again, I keep going back to this: work most of the major muscle groups through a full range of motion at an intensity that's kind of uncomfortable. And you could do that for the major muscle groups a multitude of different ways. Could you do a leg press over a squat? Sure. Could you do a goblet squat over a barbell squat? Sure. I mean, could it be all machine based? Sure. It's really a personal preference. And if you look at like adherence data, like what makes people adhere to an exercise program, it's usually self-selected exercises that they enjoy. There's some other data about self-selected loads, et cetera, et cetera. But if I had my druthers, if I got to pick somebody's like trajectory, they would train in multiple different rep ranges at intensities that all got them somewhere near failure. So 4 RIR, reps in reserve, or somewhere in that 4 to 2 reps in reserve, that kind of be the intensity level. But yeah, they do sets in the 4 to 6 rep range. They do sets in the 6 to 10 rep range. They do sets in the 10 to 15 rep range, understanding that there are unique adaptations that occur at each one of these sort of rep schemes. And multiple different exercises. So our exercise variation would be high, but they'd all be self-selected, right? And then it doesn't need to just be squat, bench, deadlift, press. It could be leg press, machine press, dumbbell press, and a kettlebell deadlift, or, whatever. There's just infinite ways to do it. And I think there are trade-offs to everything. And the injury risk thing, I think, is a part of a bigger social learning problem I don't know if it started in the medical, sort of medicalization of exercise that happened in the 80s with Dr. Cooper, who's now part of the Cooper Institute. I think he's done a lot of great things for the industry. But the thought here is that we explain various musculoskeletal problems as tissue damage or as having fragile tissues. You think about how most people describe osteoarthritis, and they're like, well, it's wear and tear on the joints. Or when they describe knee pain, it's like, oh, it's bone on bone. Or low back pain, it's like there's something wrong in your lumbar spine. It's either a herniated disc, a bulging disc, a torn ligament, something, right? It's always a mechanical problem. But then so they're like, well, if I do this exercise and I have bone on bone, that's going to make it worse. Or if I have a wear and tear issue, and I do exercise, particularly weight bearing activity, that's going to be worse. But then when you look at the data on osteoarthritis, on low back pain, on most musculoskeletal issues, the people who are most active have the lowest sort of not only pain sort of scores, but also the lowest incidence of like requiring care, healthcare. And so that doesn't mean that everybody should go from 0 to 100, like Drake would say, but but working towards those physical activity guideline minimums, that's fine. But all of this is social learning. People, they learn it from their doctor, they learn it from their parents, they learn it from their PT, they learn it from somebody on a social media account who uses mushroom clouds to describe what happens if you flex your lower back. And it's like, I don't know that that's helping anyone. We want to explain things, meet them on their level in a way that they can conceptually kind of get what's going on, so they feel like, okay, I got an answer. But I don't know that we should be doing it in a way that builds these limiting and harmful narratives. And that's like one of the big things that we at Barbell Medicine, we kind of like get into online fisticuffs with people. They're like, we'll say, well, I probably wouldn't say it like that, because words matter. And you know, if your mom or somebody in your family, you're trying to get them to resistance training and they've been told, you know, for the last 20 years, well, you got osteoarthritis, it's bone on bone, or you've got this, you know, knee thing because your meniscus is torn. It's like, how do you get them then to load that?
Yeah.
Can you just show them the data that says, well, actually people with osteoarthritis who are more active, who resistance train, have lower pain than people who don't? Or the incidence of low back pain is higher in sedentary populations than active populations? Or, you know, certain, you know, exercise seems to do better for low back pain than not exercising. Like you can't just show them the data and then they're going to change their mind. Yeah. Because this stuff has been like almost built into their fund of knowledge for years and years and years. And so I think where that starts is this, we got to change the social narrative and the social sort of discussion points on this. And we're trying, but we're only so many people. And so everybody listening to this and other podcasts we've done, if I know that you guys want to take home like little nuanced points and like impress your friends, but the big thing is going to be how you talk about injuries, how you talk about pain, how you talk about the stuff to people, because without this social change, nothing's going to change from the general population standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm quite glad you touched on how the words that we use and how we explain things to people, because sometimes, you know, when people go to physios or doctors, they can be told they've got something and think, oh my God, like I'm never going to walk again. I'm going to just have to sit here and not move because I'm going to hurt myself. And maybe on a little bit of a tangent, but do you think that's the reason why? Because again, I'm sure you've seen it. I've had clients who have come and they've had an injury from the past, and you know they'll say, okay, so what was that? Or what previous injuries have you had? And they'll say, well, I can't squat. I can't squat because I got told I've got this with my knee or my hip or anything like that. And it's kind of shutting down a lot of options that they can do, or you know, taking them out of physical activity rather than thinking about, right, this is what we've got to work with. We can't do this at the minute. But like with anything, you know, trying to put a little bit of load in, trying to add in a little bit of progression, a starting point. Do you think that's why we end up with people stopping doing exercises, or you know, trying to cut out movement patterns because they've been told, well, you've got this, so therefore this is you can't do this at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that, the limiting narratives and the we just, you know, umbrella term called nocebos have reduced people's sort of movement potential. I like Greg Lehman's thing. If you're unfamiliar with Greg Lehman's work, definitely check that out. But he's a movement optimist. Effectively, he just wants people to move in a wide variety of different ways to accomplish the task and just have different options for doing things, right? And so if you've been told, yeah, you've got this knee thing, this low back thing, this hip thing, or whatever, a lot of these things, again, which are very hard to diagnose reliably. So we kind of just are like, why are we even telling people this? Because it doesn't change the prognosis. If you tell somebody that, oh, you got a torn hip labrum, it's like, okay, so one, how reliable is that diagnosis? Two, how does that diagnosis change the prognosis? And three, like, what are you going to do about it differently? You know, so it's, anyway, that's a whole nother rabbit hole. We need another podcast to unpack all of that. And I don't want people to come at me like, well, if you have a certain torn hip labrum, you're going to do this differently. It's like, okay, yeah. All right. That's another podcast. But the whole point is that when you give people this information, you think that you're helping. Well, if I just give them more information, I'm helping them, particularly from a medical standpoint. But not always, particularly if the information kind of conjures up this idea that somebody's fragile, they can't do certain things or whatever, and there's no plan to like overcome that. I mean, look, if I saw somebody in the clinic who had, you know, 10 weeks of low back pain that was not improving, you know, the guidelines at that point suggest maybe imaging would be a good idea, and maybe we would do that. And yeah, maybe we would find on advanced imaging, so not an X-ray, that they had a herniated disc, right? And so I would tell them, hey, you have this. However, here is the trajectory. In general, these things resorb. The worse the herniation, the more likely it is to actually resorb. That means it goes back to normal. Your pain is unlikely to correlate with the degree of herniation. And we want you to be active and move and ultimately be able to do everything that you could do before and more. And so it's a different way of explaining the same thing rather than this is why you have pain.
Yeah.
this is why you have pain. And so we need to limit you because of X, Y, and Z, which is all, none of those things are like evidence-based. So telling somebody they have pain because of a particular mechanical issue outside of like trauma, like, hey man, you got shot in the leg, and so your leg is not functioning normally. Like that's very clear that that's probably the main cause of, why they're having leg dysfunction at the time, right? But although people, in the moment, if someone was shot and then was able to run for a period of time afterwards because adrenaline and this, that, and the other, that happens. So, but telling somebody this is why you have pain instills this idea that I will not be able to function normally until this is resolved. And if it's never resolved, or if it could come back or whatever, then people have, oh no, I'm fragile, I'm damaged, I can't do these sort of things. And they eliminate whole swaths of movements. Can't squat because I have bad knees. Can't deadlift because I have a bad back. It's like, you never need to like bend down or like stand up from a seated position or whatever. So to answer your question, hopefully in a more succinct manner, I definitely think the way that we talk about these things matters, particularly from a medical standpoint. But what's been happening in the fitness industry is people, personal trainers and PTs who are getting into the like coaching, strength coaching scene, they've like continued to medicalize outside of their scope of practice. So you have these trainers that go to like these rehab courses or, mobility courses or whatever. And you have somebody up there with just enough biomechanics knowledge to be dangerous, who's espousing all this stuff about, oh, well, if your obturator internus is tight, or if your glutes are tight, or medial glute is not firing well, then you're going to have this dysfunction. And then the trainer, trying to impart knowledge or impress their clientele, regurgitates that. None of the stuff is evidence-based. And you're getting this happen from all angles, right? So what is the poor client supposed to do? Yeah. I would prefer if people just, stopped saying stuff that wasn't evidence-based, and even if they were going to maybe have an idea about it, that's fine, but you have to temper those claims and choose your words very carefully in a way that doesn't limit people. And so I think it's fine to have a hypothesis, a pet hypothesis and whatever, but the way you talk about it certainly matters.
Yeah, definitely. And as well, I think sometimes, touching on that a little bit, I think sometimes coaches and PTs can sometimes step on the toes of people in their areas of expertise, whereas actually knowing what you can do as a personal trainer, as a coach yourself, and realizing when, right, okay, we need to work with a physio or work with someone a little bit more specialist, rather than trying to be a jack of all trades and ultimately, maybe causing more harm than good with the client. A couple of things that you said there, how we speak into clients, and this concept of that they're everyone's just broken. Everyone's going to have something wrong with them. Whereas actually, it is that mindset thing. I know we touched on it when we spoke at the start of the podcast around the, mindset with injuries, that the fact that, if we can focus on some movements, that actually strength training can increase people's confidence and increase their mindset surrounding things, so that even if we can deadlift, for example, but we're going to struggle squatting or anything like that, we can build confidence in this one movement and develop, a stronger mindset to build that robustness up a little bit, rather than being, oh, well, I'm just going to stay using this weight because I can't do this, rather than being, do you know what? Yeah, I'm going to try and make the best of the situation and progress forward. Do you think that's a case where strength training can improve people's robustness and mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with kind of this expectation violation. So you have somebody who doesn't think that they can deadlift or squat. For example, they got my back's bad or my knees are bad or whatever, and you find an entry point that violates what they previously thought they could do in a way that's non-threatening to them. So if they can't deadlift from the floor, maybe they can deadlift from blocks, or they can, do an RDL, or they can use a kettlebell. And at some point you get to a weight or a range of motion, you're like, honestly, this is pretty close to a deadlift, if that's something that they wanted to work towards, or that you felt like was going to be super beneficial for them. Same thing on a squat. It's like, all right, well, if there's no way I can get you to squat under any circumstance, in any, way, shape, or form, even if it's just sitting down to a box and standing back up, maybe we start on a leg press, right? You're like, well, you're pretty much doing the hip and knee flexion that's associated with the squat, so why don't we just try this, in a low stakes, low non-threatening environment. So maybe it's an assisted, they're holding on to a sturdy surface and sitting down to a box or something, just to try to, and some people are going to be more aggressive, less aggressive. It's just going to depend on the individual. All that stuff can build self-efficacy, build confidence, violate the expectations of what a person previously could do, all while building strength and capacity. So like you're getting it from both ends. So I definitely think that strength training can be very, very useful. I think that actively involving the person, and saying, hey, what do you think you can do? Where can we start in a way that it's challenging to you, but not like overwhelming. And so what I tell people is that every training session that you and I are working together on, I'm trying to meet you where you're at, both with respect to exercise selection and load selection, training load. So like every training session, the weight, how hard the exertion should feel kind of the same. Some days it's going to be heavier in absolute terms. Some days it's going to be lighter in absolute terms, but the exertion, the difficulty overall should be about the same. It's like the Greg LeMond quote, like, it never gets easier, you just go faster. And it's like, it never feels lighter, you just get stronger. That's kind of the thing. And so I'm not trying to force weight onto the bar to drive the adaptation. I'm not trying to force reps to drive the adaptation. I want it to be a similar level of hardness each time and let the fitness develop, let the movement proficiency develop, rather than, again, feeling like we have to force it. We got to progress, boom, boom, boom. It's like, it's going to happen over this natural, natural course. I just want to be there to facilitate the correct adaptations, the desired adaptations, by making sure we're not leaving stuff out, making sure that we're not eliminating movements that need to be that don't need to be eliminated. So yeah, to answer your question, I think strength training has a huge potential role here, and that's why we push it so hard, right? Somebody's injured, it's like, all right, well, we're going to modify the activity to something you can do. We're going to meet you where you're at. But I think if you ask even the quote unquote worst coach, right, and you're like, hey, should the training that you give to a client be individualized to their current levels of fitness and their preferences and goals? They'd be like, yeah, of course. It's like, great. So we're in agreement. We have, I think that's a non-controversial way to approach this.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of those things of, that you've mentioned there about, we're not trying to force anything. A lot of it is, trust it. I know it's always one of those things of, it says quite a lot, but trust in that process. And I think more so in strength training, just having that patience, because it's not always dictated by more weight on the bar, more sets, more reps, being able to actually progress to a different, a harder variation of that exercise. We mentioned the goblet squat, going to a safety bar squat or a back squat or front squat or whatever it may be. And a couple of times that we've touched on there in terms of, the misconception surrounding strength training, even though that the data and the guidelines are there for people to use. Do you think that, it's like with anything, sometimes there's a lot of noise out there and people can sometimes miss the signal that they're trying to look for? Do you think there's a lot more, information and knowledge being passed out there to see that, people aren't going to get injured getting involved in strength training? And do you think there is more of a shift in terms of people using strength training as an entry point to increase their activity?
I do think, the rates of participation in resistance training, like globally, are low. As far as, do I think they're increasing? My hunch would be yes. I don't know that it's because of there is a perception of reduced risk that's somehow like improving. I think rather just the popularity of barbell training in general and physical culture has kind of like made it cool to work out. And like, of course you got to lift weights. Like, how else are you gonna get these peach gains, or like, look like the CrossFitters that you see on TV, or the any of these other things that are now more televised than they were 15, 20, 30 years ago. And a lot of that has to do with social media as well. I think that we could leverage this in like rise in physical culture with the adjacent narrative of, and the injury risk is not as big as you think it is. like just as an addendum, right? Because now what you have with this like rise in social media, in physical culture, again, due to social media, traditional media, et cetera, is you have all these quote unquote movement experts coming out of the woodwork trying to make a buck. And I'm pro-capitalist, like do your thing, make your money, provide great services to people, like you're going to be fine. But the idea that you're going to reduce someone's injury risk by micromanaging their movement, particularly in either like very new individuals or very, very trained individuals, remains to be seen. Like that's not something that you could confidently say and then point to evidence. I think what's more likely to happen is when people undergo a substantial change in how they perform a task due to either outside coaching or like their own ideas about what a more efficient movement might look like, is the load reduces. And so if you reduce the training load, I think your injury risk goes down substantially for a period of time, because you're previously adapted to a much higher training load. What the problem that with keeping the training load very light is that at some point your fitness adaptations decay and your training tolerance decays. And so now you've gone too far and you've kind of increased your risk of something not great happening to you, in addition to fitness adaptations also going down. And so particularly then if you ramp the training back up too quickly. So I would prefer, if for the movement coaches out there, the movement experts, that you advertise your services or render your services in a way that's designed to help people move more efficiently from a performance standpoint, because that's what it is. It's not a health perspective. It's not an injury risk reduction perspective. It's literally just so you can move more weight, get more reps, get a better hypertrophy response, improve your endurance performance, et cetera. But it's not from like an injury risk reduction standpoint. I think that's a harder sell for a lot of non-competitive people, because not everybody is trying to compete, right? Yeah. But everybody is trying to reduce their injury risk, you know. So, and I'm trying to reduce people's injury risk too. But I know that if I sow these seeds of potential danger into people's minds about this unknown and unseen risk that has not yet popped its way up into case reports or studies or controlled settings, I can increase somebody's risk of injury. Yeah, I can increase their risk of subsequent, physical inactivity, which is ultimately bad news. So I love what's happening in physical culture scene right now, as far as like just it growing. I just wish there was a concomitant message of, and you can do this too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And you can, period.
Yeah, I think with like what you've said there about, having this thing in the background of injury prevention, it's one of those things. Is it actually injury prevention or is it good training? How do you know that you're actually preventing injuries if you're actually just, making sure that everything's balanced, which is one of those things of, it's always, not knowing how you're doing, because you don't know you're going to get injured until the injury actually happens. Do you know what I
mean? Yeah, exactly. Like most injuries there's not like a preceding set of signs or symptoms that are reliable. And because if we had those, well, they'd be part of our recommendations, like that we would happily transmit that information to you. And so the idea that you can predict an injury risk in an individual is something we're not there yet. I don't know that we'll ever get there, particularly because it's so individualized. But I think you're exactly right when you say that if the training is good and we can, what does that mean? It's appropriate for the individual, not only their goals, their fitness levels, it's auto-regulated to a point that it meets them where they're at on each individual day. They like it, they're adherent to it, meets all these other sort of criteria. That's as low as you're going to be able to make the injury risk via external factors. Yeah. Right? You can't affect somebody's social learning, their experiences, their expectations, all this other sort of stuff, how they deal with pain and you just can't, right? That's not something you can do from a programming, from a coaching perspective. So I think, if you're meeting all those criteria from a programming standpoint, you're doing as best as you can. And sometimes even then, people are going to get injured.
Yeah.
Just like the person with quote unquote perfect form, sometimes they're going to have pain.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like it just sometimes it happens.
Yeah, that's it. I've literally, just as you were saying that, I just had the Forrest Gump quote in my head. Sometimes just shit happens, and
Yeah,
it is unexpected. Quite a lot of topics, a few tangents thrown in there as well.
Sure.
The last question that I like to finish on, from everything that we've spoken about there, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from everything that we've chatted about for everyone listening?
Oh man. Well, so I think if you're a medical or fitness professional, your personal interests are your personal interests as far as what do you want to get out of your occupation. But I do think that everybody in those industries really wants to help people, really wants to promote health in their community. And I think the best way that you can do that as an individual is keep your fund of knowledge up to date. And so that's going to be by regularly participating in consuming the latest research, talking with your friends, up to colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So keeping your fund of knowledge up to date. And then also learning and regularly engaging in behavioral change counseling sort of development. That way that you can sort of transmit this message of, get started in physical activity, get started in changing your dietary pattern, meet people where they're at, what they're willing to do. That's what you're going to need. And I think too many people are focusing on the fund of knowledge and not necessarily the behavioral change aspect. And I really think it's more important that you know how to talk to somebody about changing a behavior than it is that the glycolytic intermediates of the Krebs cycle. Unless you happen to be a Krebs cycle like researcher, in which case, like, that's like, do your thing. So I would encourage people to learn more about behavioral change stuff if you're actively engaging with people one-on-one. My favorite resource for that is called Motivational Interviewing. It's by Rolnick and Miller. It's a purple book. They also have a Motivational Interviewing for Coaches, which is another great resource. And then the other thing beyond that is try to use your words very carefully when you're explaining things to people, to make sure that you are not inadvertently limiting folks. I one coach, and I can't remember his name, but he was like, I don't want to invent gravity for these folks. So you don't need to create barriers or create limitations for folks until it's already happened. You need to tell somebody, hey, this is going to be heavy, or hey, this may hurt, or hey, you may get injured, or whatever. All these things are self-limiting, or if you do it a certain way, you're going to get injured. It's like, you don't need to do that. Like you need to be there, supporting people, meeting them where they're at each session, and then ultimately tailoring the recommendation to that individual based on feedback. And that just happens iteratively, and you don't need to like create gravity for these folks and make it harder than it necessarily needs to be. So
yeah, definitely. I think that's a good way to finish on. And there was been a common theme, and you kind of rounded it up there in terms of you're engaging with people. If you're a coach, if you're a personal trainer, a physio or anything like that, you're working with people at the end of the day, and you've got to speak to that person in front of you. They're not a diagram out of a book, or some data on a spreadsheet. It's the person in front of them, and you've got to be able to speak to that person for what because they might not know the physiology and anatomy of everything that you're talking about. They just want to know, can I train? Can I make progress? Am I going to be able to get out what I want to get out? Thanks a lot, Jordan, for taking the time to jump on. Really enjoyed chatting with you for the topics that we covered. For everyone listening that might have any questions about what we've chatted about today, have a look at the resources that you and Barbell Medicine put out there, or get involved in working with yourself or Barbell Medicine. Where can people find you or reach out to you?
Sure. Probably most active on Instagram. It's Jordan_Barbell Medicine. We also have our main account, Barbell_Medicine. We have a website, barbellmedicine.com. We have a forum, which is feels very late 90s, early 2000s, but we're active on there. If you have questions, you can ask us questions there. And then lastly, we have our podcast. It's under Barbell Medicine. We have a YouTube channel, also Barbell Medicine. And if you can't get your questions answered through any of those resources, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, that's a lot. So looking forward to interacting with you guys. And thanks so much for listening.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Jordan, for taking the time to jump on. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will catch up with you all next week.